Now, up next is a panel called Decolonising Podcasting, which is our first podcast, first panel of the day. And it's all about podcasting and a conversation about the prism of diverse voices and representation, so expanding on some of the things that Sangeeta said. And hosting this is none other than the festival director herself, Nina Robinson.
We're just going to get Marcus Ryder here, who we're very pleased to welcome. Marcus is the co-host of the British Black Lives Matter podcast, and he also has a book of the same name. So if you haven't read the book, please do so. It's absolutely fantastic compilation of different stories of people who work in the, including people who work in the audio industry, about their experiences. So thank you very much. Great to welcome Marcus in the room. On the Teams call, we've got two more guests joining us, and this is Shelina Janmohamed. She'll be coming up right now. So just to explain a little bit about Shelina, she's just launched this year a new podcast which is on Global Player called The Shelina Show. And it's a fantastic podcast which is looking at news and current affairs from quite an innovative point of view. She has special guests where they explore different issues every week around news and culture, modern day Britain. But the guests that she's had on are kind of not the usual pundits and speakers that you would find like on news shows. The team that she works with try harder to, just get a different kind of voice that for me is extremely reflective of modern day Britain. So we're really happy to have Shelina on the call. And then also we have Jade, Jade LB on Instagram, at Jade LB. Jade is an author and also a writer. She's written a seminal book called Keisha the Sket, which has been published on Stormzy's Murky Books label. So brilliant to have you both. Thank you. I just thought, first of all, we could start with you, Jade, about this conversation on decolonising podcasting. Important for us to start with, what the terms, what we mean by decolonising. Jade, can you explain?
Hi, morning, and thank you for having me this morning. So decolonisation, initially, I guess, came into our vernacular as a response to what was happening in sub-Saharan Africa with the very physical removal of colonial influence. But more contemporarily, decolonisation is used in relation to removing the colonial influence in institutions and in activities. And podcasting, of course, is a growing institution.
And Shelina, could you explain a little bit about what some of the diversity issues have been in the past, do you think, that regarding the media that perhaps podcasting is able to address?
So traditional media was very hierarchical in many senses. And so the people at the top, who were the commissioners, were the gatekeepers as to what kind of stories get told, who gets to tell them, and what perspectives are told. So, to state a statement of the obvious, news selection and curation is not an objective thing. It's what is of interest, and news, and by that all the kind of thematic and content things that go with it. So as we've moved to a more, I guess, democratic way of selecting content and news, with individuals being able to create their own content and find platforms for it, that's democratized the selection. But nonetheless, the systems are still inherently structured so that there are gatekeepers and commissioners. And so broadening that out is really about finding people who can curate and commission content, presenters, producers, hosts, but also about making that more accessible to a wider audience and bypassing those traditional hierarchies and gatekeepers.
And can I ask you the same question as well, Marcus, about what are the issues around in the media at the moment that kind of podcasting might be able to bypass?
Ooh, I don't know if it can bypass any of the issues, if I'm being completely honest. And I don't want to be the downer, but I think I agree with Shelina. If you're talking about decolonisation, decolonisation is all about power dynamics. And what's really interesting for me is the last speaker, Sangeeta, what was important for her was when Audible called her up and said she got very excited. Now that's just a traditional media, they're large media platforms. So the barriers to entry into podcasting and the barriers to entry into putting your stuff on YouTube or Twitter or social media have lowered massively. Right? So that's really important. But we shouldn't confuse that with prominence. Because if you are not then selected to be on the front page of Audible, of Spotify, if you're not then selected to be, and I've been on Shelina's podcast and it's absolutely fantastic, but if you're not then selected by Global or BBC, you know, it's still incredibly, just as Shelina was explaining, it's still incredibly hierarchical, so we shouldn't confuse the lowering of the barriers to entry with an increased democratization if the prominence is still controlled by a select few companies.
Jade, you've worked for independent production companies, haven't you, in the podcast market? What has been your experience?
Yeah, I did work with an independent production company when producing the podcast, The Naughties, with Amazon. And it was really important for me to work alongside people who knew the content, who had the same sort of, feeling, the same zest, the same zeal, the same experience as myself. And we were able to connect to bring that project to fruition. And I think that I was really, really supported, particularly by my agents, in bringing on board who was necessary for that project. So, yeah, I worked with unedited and, as I said, we brought to fruition the Naughties podcast for Amazon Music last year.
Yeah, because even though there are very big corporations coming into the that are in the podcast space, I just wonder whether the fact that podcasting is supportive of new and innovative ways for the audio industry to move forward, just as Netflix has disrupted the TV industry. How far do you think that podcasting is doing that for audio?
Well, if you take Netflix as a as a metaphor, the big companies that are making programs for Netflix are the same big companies that are making programs for the BBC, for Amazon, for ITV, for Channel 4. It's Warner Brothers, it's what have you. So you always will get a few breakouts. You will get a few breakouts on Netflix. You will get a few breakouts of somebody who set up a podcast in their bedroom, and then they will be noticed. But what that means is what they've effectively done, what the big companies have effectively done, is shifted the risk, and shifted the risk and the money. So Insecure is a really good example, right? Do people know Insecure on HBO?
No, I don't know that
So
one.
sitcom-ish drama on HBO by Issa Rae, really, really popular, right? But it started off with her doing YouTube videos, so swallowing the entire cost, doing all the development, right, by herself on YouTube. HBO sees it, and now she's a multimillionaire. And the program is absolutely fantastic. I think when it was on YouTube, it was called Insecure Girl, right? So if you take that metaphor. And so what we need to be aware of, in many ways, the fantastic success stories that we see on Netflix with regards to diversity follow the same model, but it can actually be extractive of a lot of Black and Asian people, and the cost of development can be put on us, because what we're doing is that we're then making the podcasts. We are bearing all of the cost. Well, you might say it's a low cost, but it's cost in terms of labor. And then the few which are successful, then Amazon or Spotify or BBC, for that matter, can then come along and then pick you up. So they're actually, there's extractive process, exploitative process in that. Alternatively, it's the same old model where you are pitching to Amazon Music, or you're pitching to Spotify, or you're pitching to BBC Sounds and saying, I've got a great idea, which is no different from when it was really a kind of radio model. But you have a few more players now, like Amazon, like Audible.
Yes, so it's all effectively jumping on a bandwagon rather than kind of like putting in the necessary investment.
I mean, what I would say is that, and it's great we've got Jade on, is that what you do need to really decolonise it is that you need other players to come in who aren't the Amazons. And so the Stormzy's coming in. For me, if we can get some of that, that is proper decolonisation. You know, so that is fantastic.
So how do you feel about being part of Stormzy's murky books, Jade? And how do you feel that it is changing up the whole kind of media and publishing industry?
So I would definitely agree with Marcus's point that that alignment and being ultimately supported by not only the book side, but the brand in general and the person at the helm, Stormzy, is definitely, it's legitimizing ultimately for me. And I feel like I have enjoyed that, or I am experiencing sort of the benefits of that. But another thing that I think I would like to say as well is that with regard to the large corporations, so Issa Rae is a really good example. When you may be the sort of token, or you may be the lucky person that does gain some form of entry, I think that you've got important work from that point forward to do. So it's important for you to establish, you know, your own, perhaps, I don't know, publishing, or your own something whereby you firstly are able to claim your intellectual property, where you have people representing you to ensure that you benefit properly, that your ideas are not stolen, that you are not just a token here one day and gone the next, that you benefit properly. And then also that you learn enough skills and that you make enough connections to ensure that the gate is widened, that you build enough of a network with people to widen the gate and make sure that people are able to come in. So again, going back to the example of using unedited and also collaborating with No Signal actually in the beginning stages of bringing the Naughties podcast to Amazon Music, it was, again, just very, very important and a decision that I and my agent that represented me pushed for to make sure that these independent platforms were party and were benefiting from this idea ultimately that I created and that Amazon Music were funding. And my agent is a white man with a very big name in this space. And I also think that it's a bit of a tentative line to tread, in that you do need to have people like that on your side for sure, who are understanding what the work is that you're trying to do, and will use their privilege to push where necessary.
Shelina, how do you feel about, you know, you're probably one of the lucky ones who's got a show on Global Player. I mean, how do you navigate that kind of space that you're in?
So I'm at the beginning of the podcast journey. So I've just finished the first season, hopefully the first of many seasons of the Shelina Show, which is a news and current affairs podcast. And that was an invitation from Global. So you're right, it was, you know, I when I got the email saying, would I like a podcast? I think I screamed in my own mind for about 30 seconds and then wrote back and went, okay. So, you know, as Marcus and Jade have been saying, you know, those invitations come, or those opportunities. But having said that, they are off the back of, you know, many years of trying to raise profile and to craft a voice. And the thing that I've learned during the season, so it's been 12 episodes, is that actually podcasting while conversations around diversity and conversations around decolonisation have offered an opportunity that really hasn't existed before, and podcasting as a new and emerging technology that can be both mass and very niche, do feel very exciting as a way forward. The complex commercial and platform structures actually is something that all podcasters need to be quite aware of. And so it's about honing your craft and your voice. So it can be very exciting to kind of get a microphone and then create a podcast and stick it on a platform. But as Marcus was saying, unless people know about it, it's not going to go much beyond your friend circle. And that can lead to something bigger. But on the whole, it's probably going to stay quite limited. And there is a space with brands about niche marketing. And I think that's one of the things that brands often talk about that's exciting about podcasts, is you can be quite niche. But if you want to reach that level of prominence, there are those bigger conversations about who gets promoted, how much money is put into the marketing spend to actually raise the profile. So those are really interesting things. But one thing I just personally wanted to share that I've learned is that, you know, great production is really important to a good podcast. And that you do need to, I think some people are naturally talented and can create that, but actually, along with being the host and thinking about the content and the point of view, great production is really important as well, to make sure that the quality of listening for the audience is really important too. And finally, I just add that in a way, so for example, I've done one series and it's starting to get traction, and you know, you kind of go around and go, oh, Shelina, I heard your podcast, it was very exciting, which is lovely to my ego, which is great. And anyone who wants to add that at the end in the chat is very welcome. But I think one of the things to think about when we're talking to platforms or having this bigger conversation is that nobody becomes a breakout podcaster or changes the dynamic of the conversation until you get a chance to build your followership. So, you know, 2 seasons, 3 seasons, 4 seasons, multiple podcasts. And I think the conversation with platforms and commercial partners, when they're thinking about diversity, is still very much like, oh, well, we gave them a platform. Did they succeed? Did they not succeed? I don't know. But actually, we need to now push that conversation in a way that Jade was saying, to make it actually, you invest in 1 season, 2 seasons, 3 seasons, some spend. That's when you start to see whether there's going to be an impact on wider society.
Yeah, but that's really interesting, Shelina, because I think you bring in a lot of your background in advertising and marketing to be able to have an insight into, you know, because really it comes down to money as well at the end of the day. And you mentioned as well about the structures that are currently in place, that you need that kind of institutional structural support, you know, but I just wanted to say about, ask a question about podcasting and how it supports new voices and new formats. What are some of the podcasts that, you know, you've been particularly, you know, encouraged by and optimistic about the podcasting space? You can say your own, Marcus.
I was on Shelina's podcast. I think it's a brilliant podcast. I mean, if I'm being honest, and I completely echo what Shelina was saying with regards to the need to build your following. So, for example, on Black British Lives Matter podcast, the first episode of that, we rammed it full of what we thought were the most famous people we could get. So we had Afua Hirsch, we had Paul Boateng, Lenny Henry, obviously, you know.
Marvin Cole, who's on the advisory board for the Podcast Festival.
That's true.
Oh,
right?
that was on the book.
But the point I was trying to make is that the first episode, we rammed it full of like as many famous people as we thought would. It got like 1,000 listens, downloads, like nothing. By the time we get to number 10, which happened to actually, I think, might have actually been Marvin Cole's one. And again, we're just trying to pack it full of famous people. So we have David Harewood on it as well. You know, by that time, we're into the tens of thousands, right? And the tens of thousands is still not massive, right? But it absolutely builds. So if we're not given the opportunity to build and have season 2 and have season 3 and what have you, I was, you know, genuinely shocked at how few listeners and how few downloads we had.
And also, I mean, you had the backing of Faber Books as well.
We had the backing of Faber Books, and as I said, we, normally, Afua Hirsch sneezes, and there'll be a few million likes on her Instagram. So I was genuinely surprised, and so but it just goes, to show, and the fact that we built just echoes Shelina's point that you really need to have that long-running thing. Very, very quickly, with regards to prominence. BBC gets into, when you pick up your remote for your TV, right? Number 1 on your remote is BBC 1. Number 2 on your remote is BBC 2. Number 3 is ITV. Number 4 is Channel 4. That is not a coincidence. That is Ofcom regulating, right? It's not just like Sony or whoever. That is Ofcom regulating how your remote is. Now, if you bother to take the time, you could actually change that, but no one ever does, right? So it means that your remote automatically has BBC One, has BBC and the other public service broadcasters, right, in prominent places on your thing. So prominence is really important. BBC Sounds, when it launched, they didn't know whether it was just going to be BBC podcasts on it or whether it was going to be a platform for lots of other podcasts. Now, I would argue, and they are still debating that. Right, there's still a paper, which is a consultation, which is going through.
I did not know that they even considered to put others on there.
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
And they're still considering that, right? Now, what we're doing right now by leaving it up to Spotify or leaving it up to Apple Podcasts is we're letting American companies decide who should have prominence, right, on that homepage, right? And if you talk to the BBC, they will lobby, and they do lobby government incredibly hard to make sure that they have prominence on everybody's TV remote. Prominence is really important. And so if there's one message I want to get across today, is that when you talk to your MP, if you have debates, podcasts have to be about prominence. Are you on that homepage? Who decides who's going to be on that homepage?
Well, I wonder as well, like with the technology, like how that is going to develop, because, I've noticed on my podcast, platform that it's very difficult to find what you're looking for, and it is a process of search. So if you are looking for something a bit more obscure, then you'll be able to find it. But more often than not now, you get the kind of, you're pushed to go towards certain content. I just wanted to make a point to clarify what Jade was saying. When we're talking about unedited, it's we are an edited independent production company. Bernard Achampong is one of our guests coming up this afternoon. He's the CEO of that production company. And they're making really exciting programs, aren't they, Jade? Like, how did you find working there? And, what are some of the kinds of podcasts that you like to listen to and champion the space in terms of diversity?
Yeah, I think we are Unedited are doing some phenomenal work. They've got a growing team, a very diverse team, as you can imagine. And it's just great to see, predominantly Black people making waves in the audio space. And it was good to see that, be a part of it, and also have the opportunity to dream a little bit, to see what's possible. And in terms of some of the podcasts that I listen to, some independent podcasts particularly, so I'm really, really enjoying at the moment a podcast called Toya Talks, and it is hosted by a Black woman who talks about navigating the world of work as a Black woman. And it's completely independently produced by herself, edited, etc. So yeah, that is something that I find very helpful and I'm really enjoying.
I'll have to say I'm loving The Receipts. I absolutely love that one. And that's a Spotify original, and they've really gone from strength to strength. They started as independent. They actually went to BBC for a while, and they got edited too much. So then that was not the right platform for them. And then they moved now to Spotify. But Shelina, I just wondered, how do you feel about how profitable the podcasting is at the moment? Who are the real winners and losers so far, and who do you see the winners and losers as being in the future?
Might be really naughty and just answer a totally different question, which I've been thinking about. Just in terms of going back to some of this conversation around, Marcus was talking about getting really famous people on to, ensure you get listenership. And I guess that's a knock-on impact in terms of, commercializing your podcast and making sure you have wider reach. So kind of a little bit connecting to you. But one of the challenges I found on the Shelina Show was that the promise was that we would start to get people on who you wouldn't normally hear, particularly from different backgrounds, and to use that platform to showcase different perspectives and to elevate commentators who aren't the normal people you would see on TV. Because I don't know about everybody in the room, but one of the frustrations I have when I watch, and mine is a news and current affairs podcast, one of the frustrations is all the commentators kind of look the same and they all seem obsessed about the same little things. And I kind of end up throwing things at the TV or radio programs going, what about this perspective? Or this is a really interesting person. Why aren't you talking to them? So my promise was that I would get people on to give a different perspective on the news and current affairs. But the challenge then becomes, to Marcus's point, if you bring on a new voice, how do you make sure that gets prominence? Because the way to get prominence in podcasting is to get people who already have a following or are quite famous. So you're stuck in this paradox until you have enough following and platform, but then you've totally undermined your own promise. So I don't know what the answer to that paradox is. But there's also an associated challenge, which is that, in a way, people who have what we might consider minority voices or diverse voices, which is a terrible phrase, but we'll go with it for now, aren't just for other people like us. What we're trying to do is change the overall dynamic of the point of view, who gets prominence, who gets to set the conversation in society. And you want to do that on your own terms rather than kind of homogenize yourself to fit into other people's views. So let me explain that with an example. So the title of my podcast, The Shelina Show, started as a bit of a joke, to be honest, because we were brainstorming titles and I was like, oh, it'd be cool. It's like alliterative, right? Shelina Show. And then when it launched, because it's a news podcast, I realized actually how impactful it is to have a news program with a name in it, because actually the kind of news programs we have set the agenda. The Laura Kuenssberg Show, the Andrew Marr Show. So actually having somebody's name in the news show is quite a landmark statement. And then we thought about the artwork, and again, part of that putting a face to it, we chose a picture of me obviously wearing a headscarf, because I wanted to say, this is a kind of a different perspective on it. But then, of course, when you look at the full range of imagery and artwork in the different podcasting platforms, it's not entirely obvious. Or, sometimes I wonder, and this is not a thought I like having, but sometimes I wonder, is that going to put people off because they'll see the image and go, well, I'm not sure I want to hear her talking about the news. So these are really difficult paradoxes to resolve, because if we want to change the way content and voices are done, you have to stand your own ground and stand for your own identity. But on the other hand, you also want to break through and make sure the people who wouldn't normally listen to you find it accessible. And you want to do that without kind of, conceding your authenticity. I don't know what the answer is, but I just thought that would be kind of interesting thing to talk about. How do we start to broaden out, diversify, decolonize that range of voices when you're facing these different kind of challenges?
Yeah, I really agree with you about that, because when I was working on different news programs for the BBC, quite often it would be a real frustration not to have the range of voices. And I loved the podcast that you did that featured the Birmingham woman who was talking about disability. I just thought she was so fantastic and was just so interesting. I wanted to ask you, Marcus, about you put out on Twitter something about how Spotify had all of this D&I, diversity and inclusion money that they'd dedicated for more, diverse programming, and hardly any of it had been spent, which I thought was really shocking. Is that one of the answers going forward? Is kind of having certain pots of money towards like, putting on shows like the Shelina Show that is dedicated to diverse voices?
Yeah, quite possibly. So I think if we're looking at television or conventional radio model, the way that public service broadcasting television is regulated is that a certain amount of television productions need to be made outside of London because they recognise that we need regional diversity. If you look at Channel 4's license pre-2003 Communications Act, they had built into their license the requirement to have a certain amount of diversity programs that they had to make. And it was realized that if you just left it up to the market, then, diversity may or may not come to the surface. And also the way that media often works is that there's a natural tendency for consolidation. And so that can actually have the effect of crowding out diversity. Now, the podcast model is going to be slightly different because the barriers to entry are a lot lower. So I'm not sure if it's not the exact equivalence. But at the same time, the idea of copying the TV model, which is around the world of public service broadcasting, of ring fencing money for certain types of genres, ring fencing money for certain types of productions, I'm definitely not against that, and we should be looking at that. That would be a more grown-up conversation.
I don't know why they're not spending that money. Hopefully they will start spending that money.
Yeah, and it's up for people so my day job is working with the Lenny Henry Centre for Media Diversity, and it's up for organisations like us to make sure that when Spotify makes a massive announcement following the murder of George Floyd that they're going to be spending X million on diverse productions, or when the BBC announced it was going to be spending 112 million on diverse productions, it's up for us to keep track of that and keep them to account. Regulators should also be doing that, but and it's up for people like Nina, who's done fantastic work with the centre, coincidentally, to actually crunch the figures. And the work that Nina did, well, she can speak for herself, was looking at the diversity of newsrooms, and we need to do that constantly rather than just taking people at face value.
Yeah, you can read that full report on the Lenny Henry website. It looks at the senior leader layer of newsrooms in the UK, and really it is that senior leader layer. I mean, we did touch on this around gatekeepers. I just wanted a quick question before we go to questions in the audience. What do we think about what is happening with gatekeepers in podcasting? Is that different to what's come before in your experience, Jade?
So I wouldn't say that I've got extensive experience time-wise, but I think more, if I could go back more to the point where we were touching on sort of money and funding, and it might tie into the gatekeeping point, but I think that one thing that I found, and I think that Shelina might have touched on this a little bit earlier on, but sort of treating a lot of diverse elements within podcasting that the powers that be decide to fund as one-trick ponies, or as having very, very limited sort of shelf lives. So only funding 1 or 2 seasons, for example, or only funding sort of one person or one concept, or keeping the concepts that are funded very, very, very limited. And I think that is a big issue. That's a big problem. And I think maybe to the point about gatekeepers, there are, of course, powerful figures within podcasting who make these decisions. And I think that when we decolonize in earnest, we begin to sort of do away with these ideas that we can only fund 1 or 2, or we can only fund 1 season, or we can only give money to one particular sort of concept. So I guess in answering your question about gatekeepers, I think that there is definitely still a prominence when it comes to those who are in charge and what they're doing, and we see sort of the repeated same thing happening across platforms, which indicates that there are gatekeepers indeed.
Shelina?
To echo Jade's point, in terms of content production, and creative sectors are so powerful in creating our culture, I think the same systemic issues arise in every single part of the creative economy, and podcasting sits within, content production. And so along with having more people who produce and present and, initiate podcasts, those positions in senior leadership also, need to change. And I think that's a slow process. But, Marcus is the expert on how systemically we can make those changes.
So we've got some time for questions from the audience. If anybody's got anything, have the microphone there.
Hey, Marcus, I just wanted to clarify something you said as you began, I think, that...
I want to say thank you so much. Marcus Ryder MBE, Janmohamed from the Shelina Show, and Jade Ben from Murky Books. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, and thank you, Nina, for that as well. Some very important topics of conversation there. We've got a 5-minute break, so if you could please be back here for 11:45. Also, this is your opportunity to take pictures for the microphone giveaway. We've got 2 microphones to give away. All you got to do, take a photo, be as creative as you want, upload it to Twitter or Instagram, and use the hashtag BHAMPodfest23. That's BHAMPodfest23. Thank you.